9 days after we buried my father, a woman named Renata Alvarez called our family home and asked to speak with Mrs. Ochoa, my mother's name, spoken by a stranger with the specific, casual familiarity of someone who had every reason to believe she was calling her own mother-in-law. My mother took that call standing in our kitchen, and I watched her face change in a way I had never seen in 41 years of being her daughter, confusion sliding, over the course of maybe 90 seconds, into a kind of stunned, disbelieving horror, before she finally, quietly, asked the woman on the other end of the line, "I'm sorry, who exactly are you to my husband?" The answer, once my mother finally hung up the phone and turned to face me, standing frozen in our kitchen doorway, was that my father, Ernesto Ochoa, married to my mother for 39 years, father to me and my two brothers, had also been married, for the past 22 of those same years, to a woman named Renata in Phoenix, Arizona, 400 miles from the Albuquerque home where the rest of us had lived our entire lives. A second, entirely separate family. Complete with two half-siblings I had never once heard mentioned, built and maintained in near-total secrecy during what my father had always described to us as regular, extended business travel for the construction supply company he ran. It took us 5 months, 2 attorneys, a DNA testing lab, and more difficult, tearful phone calls than I can count to figure out which of my father's 2 marriages was even legally valid, how his estate would actually be divided, and hardest of all, whether either family could find a way to make room for the other in whatever came next. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including, as today's story will show you, a war none of us even knew we were part of until the man at the center of it was already gone. Today's story is called The Wife in the Other City. Let's begin. My name is Monica Ochoa Reyes. I'm 41 years old. I work as a pharmacist in Albuquerque, and my father, Ernesto Ochoa, died 6 months ago of a sudden, massive heart attack at the age of 68 while driving on Interstate 25, a death that was, in every immediate, practical sense, a devastating but relatively straightforward tragedy. The kind of loss our family, however painful, understood how to grieve. Right up until the moment Renata Alvarez's phone call revealed that almost nothing about my father's actual life had been what any of us believed it to be. My father built a moderately successful construction supply distribution business over roughly 30 years, a company that required, throughout my entire childhood and well into my adulthood, regular travel, trips he described, consistently and specifically, as visiting suppliers, clients, and industry trade shows across the Southwest. Trips that took him away from our home in Albuquerque for anywhere from a few days to, occasionally, a full week or more at a stretch. A pattern so consistent and unremarkable throughout my entire life that none of us, not my mother, not me, not either of my 2 brothers, ever thought to question its underlying explanation. My mother, Isabel Ochoa, is 66 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and had been married to my father for 39 years at the time of his death. A marriage that, from every vantage point available to me as their daughter, appeared genuinely stable, if perhaps somewhat conventionally distant in the specific, undramatic way many long marriages of that generation sometimes are. I want to be honest that there had been periods, over the decades, when my mother had expressed occasional, passing frustration about my father's frequent travel, about the specific, sometimes inconvenient timing of his absences around important family events. But nothing in that ordinary, garden-variety marital frustration had ever suggested, to any of us, anything approaching the actual scope of what was eventually revealed. My father's funeral, held roughly 1 week after his death, was attended by nearly 200 people. Extended family, longtime business associates, church community members who had known him for decades. A genuinely large, warm gathering that reflected, in every visible way, a life fully and openly lived within our community. I want you to hold that image clearly in mind, because it becomes directly relevant to understanding the specific, disorienting shock of what came next. My father's second family, the family he had built and maintained in Phoenix for over 2 decades, was, as far as any of us could determine, entirely unaware of his death for those first critical 9 days, unaware that the man they knew as their own husband and father had died at all, until Renata, apparently growing concerned after several days of unanswered calls and unreturned texts, finally, through a combination of her own worried searching, and eventually, a local Albuquerque newspaper's brief published obituary she happened to find online, discovered the truth, and made that fateful, world-shattering phone call to my mother. I want to describe, honestly, what it felt like, standing in our kitchen doorway, watching my mother's face change during that call, before I fully understood what was actually happening. I initially assumed, in the confused first moments, that this was perhaps an unfamiliar business associate calling with condolences, or possibly some kind of scam or misunderstanding. It was only once my mother hung up the phone, turned to face me with an expression of such complete, stunned devastation that I understood. Immediately, this was something considerably more serious than any explanation I could have quickly imagined, that the actual scope of the situation began to take shape. "Your father," my mother said, her voice barely functioning, "apparently has another wife, and she says 2 other children, in Phoenix." The hours and days that followed that initial phone call unfolded in a kind of disoriented, shell-shocked fog that I think anyone who has experienced genuinely devastating, unexpected news will recognize. The specific sensation of trying to process information so far outside the boundaries of what you believe to be true about your own life that your mind, for a period, simply struggles to fully integrate it as real. My mother, once she'd had a few hours to absorb the initial shock, called Renata back directly, a conversation I sat beside her for, both of us equally uncertain what to expect or how to even begin approaching a discussion this unprecedented and this painful. What emerged over that first difficult call and several subsequent conversations in the following days was that Renata Alvarez had married my father 22 years earlier, in a ceremony in Phoenix, believing him to be genuinely, legally available to marry. A marriage that had produced 2 children, a daughter named Alina, now 20 years old, and a son named Marcus, now 17, both of whom had grown up believing my father to be their genuinely devoted, if frequently traveling, father. The same way my brothers and I had grown up believing exactly the same thing 400 miles away. Renata's own account of my father's absences mirrored, with an eerie, painful precision, the exact same explanation he had given our own family for decades: regular business travel across the Southwest, trips that took him away from Phoenix for stretches that we would eventually piece together, corresponded almost exactly to the periods he was actually, simultaneously present with us in Albuquerque, an elaborate, sustained double life apparently built and maintained through nothing more sophisticated than a consistent, carefully managed travel schedule, and we could only assume a considerable amount of deliberate, ongoing deception toward both families equally. "I don't understand how this was possible," my mother said, during one of those early, difficult conversations, more to herself and to me than as an actual question directed at Renata. 39 years, Monica. How does someone maintain something like this for 39 years without either of us ever finding out? Piecing together the actual mechanics of my father's double life became, in the following weeks, its own strange, difficult project, undertaken partly out of genuine practical necessity, given the legal and financial questions his estate now raised. And partly, I think, out of a very human, very understandable need to make sense of something that otherwise felt almost impossible to fully comprehend. My father's construction supply business genuinely did require regular travel across the Southwest, providing a real, legitimate cover for the pattern of absences both families had experienced throughout their marriages. He maintained, we discovered, entirely separate sets of financial accounts for his Albuquerque and Phoenix lives, not from any single shared business account that either family might have noticed irregularities in, but through what appeared to be a carefully structured arrangement in which his primary business income was split, informally but consistently, between supporting both households, funneled through separate personal accounts that neither family had reason to independently investigate or cross-reference against the other. He had, we eventually learned through Renata's own account, married her under his genuine, legal name, meaning that whatever legal question ultimately existed about which marriage held actual legal validity, it wasn't a question complicated by any use of a false identity or fabricated legal documentation on his part. He had simply, apparently, never formally divorced my mother, and had, 22 years into that undissolved first marriage, married Renata anyway, in what constituted, under both New Mexico and Arizona law, an act of bigamy, a marriage to Renata that, however genuine and sincerely experienced by her and by their 2 children, was not, in the strict legal sense, actually valid, given his undissolved prior marriage to my mother. I want to pause here and note something important, because it becomes central to how the following months of legal and emotional navigation unfolded. The fact that Renata's marriage was not legally valid did not, in any way, make her or her children's experience of that marriage and family any less real, any less genuinely lived, or any less devastating to have discovered, was built on a foundation of deception they had no more knowledge of than we did. Renata was not, in any meaningful moral sense, the other woman in the way that phrase sometimes implies. She was, as much as my own mother, a woman who had genuinely, sincerely believed herself to be my father's legitimate wife, deceived just as completely and just as painfully as my mother had been, simply from the other direction of an elaborate, sustained lie. I want to introduce my half-siblings, Alina and Marcus, because meeting them, in the weeks following that initial devastating phone call, became one of the most emotionally complicated and eventually meaningful parts of this entire ordeal. Alina, 20 years old at the time, a college student studying nursing at Arizona State University, and Marcus, 17, a high school senior, had, like me and my 2 brothers, grown up genuinely, completely believing my father to be their devoted, if frequently traveling father, attending, we would learn, an almost mirror-image version of the same kind of childhood milestones my own brothers and I had experienced 400 miles away. With the same man present for some and absent for others, according to a travel schedule none of us had ever had reason to question. My first conversation with Alina occurred roughly 3 weeks after the initial revelation, a video call arranged carefully, tentatively, by both our mothers, neither of us entirely certain, going into it, what we even hoped to say to each other or what kind of relationship, if any, might be possible between 2 half-sisters who had learned of each other's existence only weeks earlier, in the middle of both simultaneously grieving the same father under such profoundly different, painful circumstances. I keep looking at old pictures of him, Alina told me during that first call, her voice carrying a specific, raw grief I recognized immediately, because it mirrored, almost exactly, my own. Trying to figure out which trips were actually to see you and your family, instead of the business trips he told us about. I don't even know how to be angry at him properly, because I'm also just so sad, and I don't know how to hold both of those feelings about someone at the exact same time. I told Alina, honestly, that I was navigating exactly the same impossible combination, and that I didn't have any better answer for how to hold it than she did. Once the initial, overwhelming emotional shock had settled into something slightly more manageable, both families found ourselves needing to navigate the genuinely complicated legal reality my father's death and double life had created. A situation that required, given the significant legal and financial stakes involved, both families retaining separate, independent legal counsel. My mother retained an estate attorney in Albuquerque, David Whitfield, who specialized in exactly this kind of complicated, multi-jurisdictional estate matter. While Renata, working with her own attorney in Phoenix, a woman named Carla Jimenez, pursued her own separate legal analysis of her rights and her children's rights regarding my father's estate. The core legal question, as David explained to my mother and me during our first formal consultation, centered on the fact that my parents' marriage, having never been formally dissolved, remained the only legally valid marriage at the time of my father's death, meaning that, under strict New Mexico probate law, my mother retained her full legal status as his surviving spouse, with all the associated inheritance rights that status conferred, while Renata's marriage, however sincerely believed and lived, held no independent legal standing whatsoever as a marital relationship. This creates a genuinely difficult situation, David explained, because while the strict legal framework is actually fairly clear regarding your mother's status, it doesn't fully address the question of Alina and Marcus, who, regardless of their mother's marital status, are your father's biological children, and as such, retain independent inheritance rights as his legal heirs, entirely separate from any question about the validity of Renata's marriage to him. This distinction between Renata's own lack of legal spousal standing and Alina and Marcus's independent, unambiguous rights as biological children became the central organizing framework for how the following months of estate negotiation eventually unfolded, requiring, ultimately, both families to work through DNA testing to formally, legally confirm Alina and Marcus's paternity, alongside a broader, difficult negotiation about how my father's estate, valued at just over $1.4 million once his business holdings, life insurance policies, and various accounts and properties were fully accounted for, would ultimately be divided among 5 children who had, until a few weeks earlier, had no idea the other 2 even existed. I want to describe what it felt like, coordinating the DNA testing process with Alina and Marcus, because even though none of us seriously doubted, at that point, that they were genuinely my father's biological children, the resemblance, once we finally saw photographs of them, was, frankly, unmistakable, and their own accounts of their childhood left little realistic room for doubt. There was still something specifically painfully clinical about needing to formalize a sibling relationship through a laboratory process, rather than simply through the ordinary, lived recognition that any family typically extends to its own members without requiring scientific verification. I understand why we need to do this legally, Alina told me, during a conversation shortly before we all traveled to a neutral testing facility in Santa Fe to complete the process together. But it still feels strange, needing a piece of paper to prove I'm actually your sister, when I already know it in every other way that actually matters to me. The DNA results, once processed roughly 3 weeks later, confirmed, unsurprisingly but still with a specific, formal weight, that Alina and Marcus were indeed my father's biological children, formally establishing their legal standing as his heirs, and clearing the way for the broader estate negotiation to proceed with full legal clarity about exactly who held what rights and claims. The actual negotiation over how my father's $1.4 million estate would be divided, conducted over the following 2 months through a combination of direct family conversations and formal mediation facilitated by both families' attorneys required navigating a genuinely complicated legal and emotional landscape that I want to walk through carefully, because I think the specific, thoughtful way both families ultimately approached this negotiation offers something genuinely instructive beyond just the particulars of my own family's situation. Under the strict legal framework David had outlined, my mother, as the only legally recognized surviving spouse, held a statutory claim to a meaningful portion of the estate independent of any division among the children, a legal reality that, David explained, could have been pursued to its fullest, most legally aggressive extent, potentially leaving Alina and Marcus with a considerably smaller share than a full, equal division among all 5 children would produce. My mother, in a decision I want to be honest surprised me, given the genuine, devastating betrayal she had personally experienced, chose not to pursue that maximally aggressive legal position. Alina and Marcus didn't do anything wrong, my mother told me, during one of our own difficult private conversations as we worked through how to approach the negotiation. Their mother didn't do anything wrong either, as far as I can tell. She was deceived just as completely as I was, just in the opposite direction. I'm angry at your father, Monica. I'm not angry at 2 children who grew up loving a father they had no more reason to doubt than you and your brothers did. I don't want to build my own healing on making their situation worse than it already is. This decision, once communicated to Renata and her attorney, meaningfully shifted the tone of the entire subsequent negotiation, moving it away from an adversarial legal fight over technical spousal rights and toward something closer to a genuine, if still difficult, collaborative effort among 5 siblings and 2 mothers trying to find an equitable resolution that honored both families' genuine, legitimate claims to a man neither had fully known. The final settlement, reached through mediation roughly 4 months after my father's death, divided his estate in a structure both families ultimately agreed reflected a genuinely fair accounting of the situation, given its unprecedented complexity. My mother received her full legal spousal share under New Mexico law, alongside an additional negotiated portion reflecting her 39 years of marriage and the assets she and my father had built together over that time, including their shared home and a portion of his retirement accounts. The remaining estate, including the bulk of his business holdings and life insurance proceeds, was divided equally among all 5 children, me, my 2 brothers, Alina and Marcus, a structure that Renata, once the negotiation concluded, told me she felt represented, as fair an outcome as anyone could reasonably expect, given how impossible this entire situation is to make truly, fully fair for anyone. Renata herself, given the legal invalidity of her marriage, received no independent spousal share of the estate, a legal reality that, while technically correct under both New Mexico and Arizona law, my mother, David, and Carla ultimately worked together to soften somewhat, negotiating a separate, modest supplemental payment to Renata specifically, drawn from the children's collectively agreed-upon shares rather than from any independent legal entitlement. In recognition of her 22 years of genuine, if unknowingly invalid, marriage and partnership with my father, and the genuine financial disruption his death, and the subsequent revelation of the marriage's legal status, had caused to her own household and her ability to continue supporting Marcus through his remaining years of high school. I want to describe how that specific negotiation unfolded, because I think it reflects something genuinely meaningful about how both families ultimately chose to handle this situation. It was Alina, notably, who first raised the idea of the children collectively contributing a portion of their own shares to support Renata directly, during a family mediation session roughly 6 weeks into the process. My mom built her entire life around a marriage that turned out to be legally fake, through absolutely no fault of her own, Alina said during that session, according to both my mother's and David's later accounts of the conversation. I don't think it's right for the legal technicality of that fakeness to mean she gets nothing at all after 22 years, while the rest of us are all getting equal shares as his children. I'd rather take a slightly smaller share myself and make sure she's actually okay financially going forward. My brothers and I, once this proposal was formally presented, agreed without significant hesitation, and the resulting supplemental arrangement for Renata became part of the final settlement. I want to describe something that happened roughly 5 months after my father's death, once the legal and financial negotiations had substantially concluded, because I think it represents, more than any specific legal or financial resolution, the actual emotional turning point of this entire story. Both families, working together, organized a second, smaller memorial gathering, not a replacement for the original funeral my mother, my brothers, and I had held in Albuquerque before any of us knew Alina, Marcus, or Renata existed, but a separate, deliberately joint gathering held at a location roughly midway between Albuquerque and Phoenix, specifically intended to allow both families to grieve my father together, for the first time, as the single, if profoundly complicated family his life had actually, secretly connected. I want to be honest that organizing this gathering required navigating genuine, difficult tension in the planning process. Questions about how to honestly, appropriately describe my father's life and legacy to a mixed audience that included people from both his separate worlds, some of whom, like Renata's own extended family and close friends in Phoenix, were only now, for the first time, learning the full truth about the marriage they had witnessed and celebrated over 2 decades earlier. I gave a portion of the eulogy at that joint gathering, alongside Alina, each of us speaking honestly, in our own way, about a father who had been, we had both come to understand, genuinely, sincerely present and loving within each of our separate lives, even as that presence had been built on a foundation of deception that neither of us could fully reconcile or excuse. I don't think I can stand here and tell you my father was a good man, in the full, uncomplicated sense of that phrase, I said, during my portion of that eulogy. What I can tell you is that within the specific, limited world he allowed me to see, he was present, attentive, and as far as I ever knew until 5 months ago, honest. I'm still learning how to hold that alongside everything else I now know. I think maybe all any of us can do, going forward, is choose what we build with each other, now that the truth is finally out in the open, rather than trying to fully resolve what he built, deliberately hidden for over 2 decades. I want to spend particular attention on the relationship that developed, gradually and unexpectedly, between my mother and Renata, because I think it represents one of the most genuinely surprising, meaningful outcomes of this entire ordeal. I did not expect, going into this process, that my mother and Renata would ever develop anything resembling a genuine, warm relationship. The specific, painful circumstances connecting them seemed, to me, far more likely to produce permanent, understandable distance or even open hostility than any kind of actual connection. What I witnessed instead, over the following year, was a slow, careful, but genuine friendship developing between 2 women who had, in a strange and specific way, shared an experience that almost no one else in either of their lives could fully understand. We're the only 2 people in the world who know exactly what it's like to have loved that specific man for that many years, and to have discovered what we discovered, my mother told me, roughly a year after my father's death, describing a recent phone call she'd had with Renata that had run considerably longer than either of them had initially expected. In some strange way, she understands a piece of my grief that even you and your brothers can't fully access, because you were grieving a father, and I was grieving a husband. And Renata is the only other person who is also grieving that exact same kind of loss from her own separate side of it. My mother and Renata have, in the 2 years since, developed a relationship I would genuinely describe as a real, if unusual, friendship, occasional phone calls, a shared, ongoing project of comparing notes about the specific, granular details of my father's double life as they've continued to piece it together. And notably, a joint decision, reached together roughly 18 months after his death, to donate a portion of his remaining, unclaimed personal effects, old photographs, letters, small mementos from both separate lives, to each other, ensuring that both families now hold a more complete, if still imperfect, picture of the entirety of who my father actually was, rather than each family holding only their own separate, incomplete half of his life. I want to describe how my relationship and my brother's relationships with Alina and Marcus have developed over the 2 years since we first learned of each other's existence, because I think it represents the most genuinely hopeful thread running through this entire difficult story. Alina and I speak regularly now, roughly weekly, a relationship that has grown, gradually, from the careful, tentative conversations of those first difficult weeks into something I would genuinely describe as a real, close sisterly relationship, built on the specific, unusual foundation of having discovered each other as adults rather than growing up together, but genuine and meaningful nonetheless. Marcus, younger and, understandably, somewhat more guarded throughout the initial process, has grown closer to my own 2 teenage children than I initially anticipated, connecting, in the specific way teenagers sometimes do, over shared interests in video games and music that transcended, relatively quickly, the genuine strangeness of discovering a previously unknown uncle-nephew relationship in his mid-teens. We have, as a combined family, established what has become an annual gathering, held each year around the anniversary of my father's death, bringing together both families, my mother, my brothers and our own families, Renata, Alina, and Marcus, for a weekend that has evolved over the past 2 years from an initially tense, carefully managed obligation into something considerably closer to a genuine, if still unusual, family tradition. I used to think I only had one real family, Alina told me, during our most recent gathering, roughly 2 years after everything began. Now I think maybe I actually have 2, and I'm slowly learning that having 2 doesn't have to mean either one is somehow less real or less mine than the other. I want to spend some time, in closing, on the specific, ongoing process of trying to understand who my father actually was, a question that, 2 years later, I still don't feel I have fully resolved, and that I've come to accept I may never fully resolve. I have gone through old photographs, old letters, old business records, in the months and years since his death, trying to construct some coherent understanding of how a man could genuinely, sincerely maintain 2 entirely separate families for over 2 decades. Whether he experienced his own double life as a kind of ongoing, sustained deception he was somehow able to compartmentalize and live with, or whether, in some genuinely strange, difficult to fully understand way, he experienced each of his 2 lives as, in the moment, its own complete, sincere reality, holding both simultaneously in a way that most of us would find psychologically almost impossible to sustain. I don't have a satisfying, complete answer to that question, and I've come to believe, working through this with a therapist who specializes in exactly this category of family trauma, that I may simply need to accept the fundamental unknowability of another person's interior experience, particularly a person capable of the specific, sustained deception my father proved capable of over more than 2 decades. What I have found, instead of a fully satisfying answer to who my father truly was, is something I've come to value considerably more, a relationship with Alina and Marcus, and an unexpected friendship between my mother and Renata. That exists entirely independent of whatever my father's own true nature or motivations actually were. Whatever he built, deliberately and secretly, for his own reasons that I may never fully understand, the people on both separate sides of that secret have managed together to build something genuinely real and worthwhile out of its wreckage. A family considerably larger and considerably more complicated than any of us ever expected to have, but one I've come to feel genuinely, unexpectedly grateful for, even given everything it costs to discover. For every family, DISCOVRNG, a secret that isn't theirs to carry alone. If you're watching this and you've discovered, or are currently discovering, a hidden secret about someone you loved and lost, a secret family, a hidden relationship, any revelation that fundamentally rewrites what you believe to be true about your own life and history, I want to say something directly to you. The people on the other side of that secret, whoever they turn out to be, are very often just as innocent, just as deceived, and just as devastated as you are. It can be tempting, in the raw, disoriented aftermath of a discovery like this, to direct your anger and hurt toward whoever else the secret involves, particularly if that person occupied a role, a spouse, a family that feels, on its face, like it was built at your own family's expense. I understand that impulse completely, and I want to be honest that navigating past it, toward something closer to shared grief and mutual understanding, took my own family real, sustained effort, and genuinely might not have been possible without my mother's specific, deliberate choice to extend grace toward people who had, in the end, been deceived just as thoroughly as she had. That grace is not required. I want to be clear that I don't think any family navigating a discovery like this owes the other side of it automatic forgiveness or connection. And I understand that some families, facing similarly devastating revelations, will reasonably choose a different, more separate path than the one my own family ultimately found our way toward. But I want you to know that the other path, the one my family chose, exists as a genuine, real possibility, even amid something this painful and this disorienting, and that building something new and genuinely worthwhile out of a secret's wreckage, rather than simply being permanently defined by the wreckage itself, is possible, even when it initially feels completely impossible to imagine. My name is Monica Ochoa Reyes, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a secret in your own family's history, or of a relationship you've had to navigate with someone you never expected to be connected to, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.